Hello and welcome to the Next 100 Days podcast. My name is Graham Arrowsmith.
And my name's Kevin Appleby. So Graham, today we're going to have a conversation all about podcasting and getting your name out there through podcasting.
Yeah, today we've invited Tom Schwab. I hope I've got that right, Tom. But anyway, the thing is, Tom Schwab is all the way from, I think it's Wisconsin, America. Is that right, Tom?
Pretty close, just across the lake from there in Michigan.
In Michigan.
But in the Midwest of the United States here.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, Michigan's much nicer than Wisconsin. So basically, welcome from Michigan. And Tom, this is the Next 100 Days podcast. We've been going for about 7 years, and we do one a week. How typical of podcasts are we?
You are like the OGs in podcasting. I used to think somebody called me an OG and I thought it meant old guy, but I guess it is for original gangsta, right? Most podcasts die within the first 10 episodes. It's called pod fade. And a lot of times people will say, oh, there's 2.5 million podcasts out there. But what they don't say is that less than 400,000 have actually published something in the last 30 days. So for you guys to, to go over 10 episodes, you're better than 80% of the people out there. To hit that year mark is a huge thing. And where you guys are really is a commitment, right? It says a lot because I know doing it is not easy. And there's got to be times in there that it was a struggle.
No, well, to be honest with you, we died after 10 episodes, but we still keep going, which is don't know. We're the Walking Dead. We're the Walking Dead of podcasting. But no, seriously, it's so nice to have somebody who gets podcasting on. What was it that first got you involved with this area, Tom?
Well, and to me, it's an evolution, right? Not an revolution. And about 2014, I started to look at it, and my background is inbound marketing. So one of the tricks that we used to use, if you will, was guest blogging, right? To get your name out there, to get known, instead of me writing a blog and being, having 3 people read it, one of them being my wife, the other one being my mom. You would guest blog and put it up on the sites that your people were already subscribed to. So in 2014, I hypothesized you could use podcast interviews the same way. And it worked so great. At first, I thought, it's just a fluke. We kept testing it. It worked. And for me, it works even better because writing for me is a homework assignment, but talking is fun.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That one of the reasons that Graham and I have been going for 300 and odd episodes is we like talking to interesting people.
Yeah, that's true. I think we're curious as individuals, and we muck along all right. We're similar in some ways, and Kevin's not quite as good looking as me, but he struggles by.
I've got more hair than him.
That's true, but I'm modelling the sort of the Die Hard look, but it's probably Die Soft look for me. But the thing about you though, Tom, is that you help people get on these podcasts. It must be a really, really disappointing sort of outcome if you get somebody who's on episode number 8, knowing that they're not going to see episode 12.
Well, we don't, everybody has to start someplace, but we have criteria for when we put people on podcasts, right? Right. Because I have to admit that I've been on over 1,200 podcast interviews, and so many of those were early on, those ones that I was at guest number 3, and they stopped paying the hosting bill at guest number 8. No one ever heard me. The average podcast now gets 135 downloads per episode. You don't want to be on average. You want to make sure that you're on the right stages. If you just think of physical stages versus digital stages, you don't want to just be talking at any street corner. You want to make sure you're talking at the right event to the right audience.
Yeah.
1,200, Kevin.
1,200, it's a lot. But Graham, think about those stats. Now, I do get where that average of 100 and something downloads per episode comes from. Fortunately, our stats are rather better than that. But now, 350 or thereabouts episodes, we still get downloads every week that are from episode 2 or episode 3. Sadly, our guest on episode 4 is himself no longer around, but we still get downloads from the Time Doctor episode. And we also see that guests will possibly rank better in Google on our website than they often do on their own.
Very much so. We have some clients that use podcast guesting just for the search engine optimization value of it. And the first person that brought that to me was a very smart man by the name of Q Harrison Terry. He was running his first company while he was still in college, and he realized that he could get all these backlinks. He's now working for Mark Cuban for his company as director of growth there. But it's like one of those things where if you Google somebody's name, you don't really care what they say about themselves on their website. You want to see what other people say about them. And it gives that social trust, if you will, that, okay, they're been invited, they've spoken at different events, and people will listen to those.
We have our own version of that. We did some time ago. One of my colleagues did some work for me where we looked at the name recognition, just as you were saying, Tom. That we put into Google, Tom Schwab, and if we came up on page 1, little tick, page 2, little tick, page 3, well, not that fussed. But the thing is, it was something like 85% on page 1. And then if you added in page 2, it went up to about 95% for name recognition. So in other words, our podcast with that individual for their name, you're talking almost 95% page 1 and page 2. Now, I know many people won't go to page 2, but the point is, if you're on page 1, and we've had some guests, one guest in particular who was having a real tough time. Actually, he turns out to be a Google premium partner nowadays. But the point is, he had a real tough time. Somebody was effectively bad-mouthing him incorrectly on the internet, paid for by a competitor. And he wanted to nudge them off page 1. And what did he do? He came onto our podcast. And we did just what he was looking for. So we were able to help him get rid of this, and he had other ways of doing that as well. But the point being is that this idea of podcasting and name recognition for that individual is just a brilliant marketing strategy. I don't understand why people don't get that even more. Obviously, you have all the stats, but we have quite a few ourselves.
It's interesting. If you look even at like the Google knowledge boxes that show up in the Google searches, we have seen when people work with us or they're podcast guesting for at least 12 months, all of a sudden Google will say, oh, this is the Kevin Appleby they must be talking about when they search that. And that, you talk about the knowledge box, that shows up before paid advertising. And so it's incredibly valuable. And then all of a sudden, when somebody Googles your name, that's what they find. They find all the social media there. So it's very, very powerful.
You obviously have, with 1,200 episodes, you've honed a certain style, Tom, and you're giving succinct answers. So you've been media trained by the look of it. Or is it just trained because you've done it so many times?
That's a great question. And I did Toastmasters for the better part of about 4 months. Love the group and everything. But every month I would win the contest for the most knows. It's just the way I talk, right? So I don't believe that it was professional media training, right? I'm an engineer by degree. Sometimes I joke that, English is my second language. I'm not sure what my first one is.
Yeah.
But I think the more you practice, the better you get. And that could be public speaking from a stage or public speaking on a podcast interview.
How many people do you help get onto podcasts?
Over the last 8 years, we've helped over 1,000 different people.
Wow.
Typically, we work with about 250 at a time. A lot of nonfiction authors, coaches, consultants, and brands that really are ready to launch, and feel like, obscurity is their biggest problem.
Yeah. And I guess they're happy to get onto podcasts because it gives them an opportunity of, I suppose in some way, if it came onto our podcast, we'd make them feel at home anyway, because that's just the way we are. And at the end, our job is not to Jeremy Paxman somebody, which in this country means somebody, tearing a strip off. We're not trying to do that. But what we're trying to do is get to the heart of all these things, but in a way that's, just like having a chat. But we've evolved our own style between Kevin and I, and I just wonder whether or not it's a safe environment for some of these people to go and expand on themselves, in the sense if they've got something new to talk to. It's also, from a marketer's point of view, great to hear somebody who's a client talking about themselves, because it gives you all this content that you wouldn't have got.
It is safer in that most podcast hosts are not trained journalists. Right. Yeah. So you're not going to show up and they've got 10 questions and number 4 is a gotcha. Typically, it's just people that are curious and want to have the conversation. So I don't think you have to be as media trained, but I think you have to be cognizant of what you're there trying to do. Right. Sometimes I hear people will get on there and they're talking about their dogs, their hobbies. It's a great conversation, but it doesn't drive the business. The flip side is you get some people that get on there to do an infomercial. And it's funny, those interviews often get lost. I don't know what happened to the recording, but they never go live. Yeah. Right. So podcasts are an awful place to sell, but they're a great place to get that know, like, and trust. And I think as long as it's the right podcast interview, that it mashes with your audience, with your values, it can be a great place. I often warn people, be careful what podcast you go on, because now when you Google somebody's name, often their last video and their last podcast appearance will pop up, right? So make sure that you're proud of whichever one you go on, because you'd hate to have some big, 6 or 7 figure deal going on, and all of a sudden the VP that's supposed to sign off on it Googles the name, right? And he sees you on some podcast that isn't consistent with your brand. That can kill deals.
Wow. That's a major turnoff for us then, Kevin. Nobody will want to join
a lot of deals, aren't we?
Yeah. We'll be killing deals everywhere.
Yeah. In terms of, we're talking about sort of media training there, and one thing that Graham and I never do is look for a list of questions in advance that we're going to talk to the guest about. We actually hate that. And we'd much rather have the guest know roughly the topic we're talking about. Maybe we've looked at the guest website and we go and we just have a conversation. Now, there are some people as a guest that perhaps wouldn't put at ease. They kind of, it's taking them out of their comfort zone a little bit, that they don't know what they're going to be talking about. Would you see that as an issue?
I think podcasts have evolved. It used to be where the standard podcast was the same questions with the same answers, and it got really, really old. It's not interesting, right? Often I'll think of a podcast as like sitting down at a diner and there's 2 interesting people behind you having a conversation. And there's something about it where you just want to listen in on this interesting conversation. If they were just asking the busboy, they had a line of people that they were interviewing, asking them all the same questions, it becomes boring. And nobody wants to listen to the same 10 questions with the same 10, bullet point talking points. And if you're doing more than one podcast interview, think about it. If I hear on the first interview, it's like, wow, they're great. And then I go on the second interview and listen to them, and it's all the same stuff. It's like, wow, they don't know more than 30 minutes of content. It's really not interesting. So I think we call them podcast interviews, but it's really the best ones are podcast conversations.
Oh, I agree with that. The other thing is about we've had this conversation before, Tom. Do we specialize, or do we have a sort of almost like a Catholic understanding of content? We started with one on the next 100 days, and it is kind of about planning and all that kind of stuff. And can't remember the last time we did that. The thing is, for me, it's a conversation generally about business. In your case, it's going to be podcasts. The one we've just done was about imposter syndrome. We've got another one that we're doing recently was about a new net zero carbon fund. So basically, and we're talking about different things, but all the time to a sort of a relatively senior audience, somebody who's going to be, can be engaged, might be walking the dog for, 45 minutes and they tune into us, and we're damn glad they do. But the point being is that it is a conversation, and it's not necessarily going to be the same next time as it was this, with the same tired old jokes, but well, not every single time, Kevin, but the thing is, it is still a genuine conversation.
And I think it's the same theme. And podcasts evolve with time, right? You know different things. You're different people than when you started years and years ago, right? Yeah. So I think that's one of the great things. And when people start with a podcast, you have to think about that. It's like, what do you want to talk about? You've got to make it tight enough that people know what you're talking about, but not so tight that you can't evolve from that. I mean, that's one of the things that has kept me from starting my own podcast for, 7 or 8 years is I don't know that I can commit to one thing for that long. I mean, there's a reason I don't have a tattoo. It's like, it sounds like a good idea now, but I know I'll regret it a year from now. So I'm always talking about new things and evolving. And I think the best podcasts are the ones that the audience evolves with the host.
Yeah. Now, I'm involved in 2 podcasts, Tom. I'm involved in this one, which is, as Graham's just described, it's very general. And it tends to be, I suppose the next 100 days was a planning thing to start off with, but still broadly around, if this is your issue, you need to do something about this. Here's some practical things you can do to sort it out. And here's half a dozen things you can do in the next 100 days. So it's still roughly around that theme. But my other podcast is the Grow CFO Show. So it's very specific to finance leaders. It says everything in the title. Now, what I've found with that is that it's theoretically a much, much smaller niche, much narrower niche. But I've found that the listener stats for that, because it's so specific and it's pointing directly to a group of individuals, have grown far faster than this podcast. So
and there's that thing of context, right? So just in the title of the Growth CFO, you're attracting some people and repelling other ones. Might be a great podcast, but it's like, expecting your first child or pregnancy for the first time mother. It could be a great podcast, but it doesn't apply to the 3 of us, right? So in some ways, niching down there can be helpful.
Yeah, we have thought about it, but it's a bit like, well, a bit late now. 7 years, we probably got a formula that works. And I think one of the things we've done on our website is we've stuck in guest reels. We ask everybody for a testimonial. We put a few of those in, and the guests really love it. And because they feel like they've been heard, they feel like they've been in a conversation. They had a bit of a laugh. They've got across a lot of the content that they felt was valuable. We've asked sort of interesting questions, different questions maybe, or the ways in which we've asked questions have come across in a different way. It's not formulaic, can't be, because we haven't got a list of questions. So the thing is, there's a sense that from my point of view, we're giving back a little bit, but there's something like, I don't know, 350 hours of content out there that ain't going to go away. And the least it's going to do is give Kevin and myself a little bit of a lift. But more importantly, there's, 300 or so guests of ours, a lift as well. And, for a good time to come, it's not going to go away. I mean, for 7 years, and like Kevin was saying, people still go back to the first 2 or 3 podcasts and start listening there to see. We would advise them, don't do that. Start at 200. By that we've figured it out by then. But that, I guess, up to a point, I'm not so exercised by the fact that it's not a specialist about marketing or a specialist about finance. I'm more bothered about the fact that we are in that middle. They say about marketing, you shouldn't be right in the middle. be on one of the peaks, be on one of the sides, very niche. And I'm thinking, well, I don't know about that. I mean, as an American, you had Letterman and other people at night. I mean, were they specialists? Had all kinds on.
They weren't, but I think more today is like micro famous, right? The people that I think would be famous, my kids would have to Google to figure out who they are, and vice versa. And it's really, how do you figure out what success is with it? And I think too often people will look at success being downloads, right? Well, how many downloads did I get? How many viewers did I get? All of that. To me, I've always said the richness of your life is the richness of your relationships. And think about it. You've had relationships with that sounded really bad, didn't it? No. With 350 guests, right? Or you have a relationship with 350 guests. And, those are the same people that are going to introduce people to you, to introduce new clients to you. I remember
you could have given your shovel to Kevin at that point, couldn't you? Let's face it. But you kept on digging. That's it's obviously a Michigan thing, isn't it? Really, but digging holes for yourself. But I know genuinely, you are right. I mean, it is about relationships. It is about friendships and things that will sustain over time. And we often have guests coming back, don't we, Kevin?
Yeah, we do. And we kind of started because we thought, we're gonna do a podcast together. We used our own networks to get our initial guests. A lot more of the early episodes than we do now were just Graham and I talking to each other. They weren't necessarily with a guest at all. We still do one or two like that. Then it kind of evolved that there were subjects that we wanted to know more about, and we found the guests to come along and talk about them. We ended up bumping into people on social media as our own networks got bigger. Conversation would lead to, this is interesting. You want to come and be a podcast guest.
Yeah.
Much, much more recently has been the piece of paper that arrives from the podcast agency. These folk didn't exist 350 episodes ago. The business model just was not there. And they're increasingly, Graham and I are getting would you like to have so-and-so on your podcast? They can talk on this subject. And 9 times out of 10, recently we've said yes. Now, we've never charged anybody for coming onto this show. Quite clearly, there's a new business model emerging here. Now, Tom, at Interview Valet, you're taking folk who want to get the exposure over several podcasts, and you're getting them onto the right shows. Great. Clearly, you're looking at shows like ours, because we've got 300 and odd back catalogue. We're not going to disappear after episode 10. So, Tom, tell us some more about how that business model works now. And should Graham and I be adapting what we're doing to fit that business model rather than just picking up the guests that take our fancy from time to time?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot of discussion going on this. And actually, I'm going to Podcast Movement next week. And there's a couple of talks specifically on this. I believe that podcaster hosts should be supported, right? The work that you do that goes into that brings great value, right? I think where we have to be very clear, and I'm speaking as an American here, the U.S. government under the Federal Trade Commission has been very clear that if somebody is there as a sponsor, they need to be recognized as a sponsor, right? There's a difference between a paid advertisement and somebody that's just on there as a guest. And as long as that is very clear, that's great. But when it becomes a confusing aspect, Bloomberg News just did an article in the U.S. about this. And it was the first time the Federal Trade Commission came out and said something about podcasts. And then there was also one that came out of Britain where the Advertising Standards Agency came back and they fined both the podcast host and the guest for not declaring what the arrangement was because there was financial things going on there. So I'm fine with that. It's just so long as always the guests know, hey, is this an ad? Is this a sponsored thing? Or is this someone you brought on because you thought the quality was there?
Yeah, it's one of those awkward ones, isn't it? Because often I'll be talking to clients, potential clients, etc. And I know we got one that's coming up, and they're likely to be a client, speaking to them tomorrow about a legal agreement. And once we got that over the line, then this client will be, and they're very well known. And basically, one of the people that are involved with them, who runs this venue, shall we say, I wanted him to be a podcast guest because he's a fascinating individual. Plus, he's done that kind of thing in other environments. So I think he'd be a fantastic guest. But it's also not unhelpful to my business to actually give them a wee bit of publicity. So what do? Do you say this? Or do you just say, you bring him along and let's have a good time? Because at the end of the day, it's not like they can go along to this venue, but it's not really
there've been a number of people that you've brought on because they're clients of yours, and you're potentially doing some marketing work for them. So you've exposed them and their product on the podcast.
Yeah.
There's people that have been around my businesses that I've been working with, and we've brought on to give them extra exposure.
Yeah.
So we've
maybe we should be saying more about that then, Kevin. Maybe we should be declare the ASA will be after us with a big stick. But they're full of twin set and pearls brigade. I mean, at the end of the day, they're permanent bloody victims.
But what's so different in what we do? But the radio shows you listen to every day on the BBC, where there's a guest along that's promoting their latest TV program or the latest book.
Tell us about your book. That's right. Yeah. So
I think it actually adds a lot of credibility if you say, hey, I have known this person for years. We have worked together because, and it's like, this is not just somebody that you met for the first time on the podcast, but you can speak to their character and their business because you've seen it in a different way there. And I think that builds trust with the audience too. Right.
That's fair.
I had a boss in the Navy that said only kids and clowns like surprises. Which one do you take me for? I don't think audiences like surprises. So just tell them what's going on there.
Oh, I like that. I'll try and remember that and use that again. But I'm sure we'll be able to adapt it.
The beauty of that is we've got this recorded, and we can cut out that clip just for you, Graham.
Oh yeah, I suppose so. Yeah. But thinking about that. When it comes to podcasts, one of the things that we do, Tom, is we do a show notes page, and basically I'll take various clips of what's going on this podcast and effectively create a short clips for things like LinkedIn and so forth, so people can actually get a sense of it. If they like what they hear, then they can come and listen to it. Actually, we are just starting to put our full episodes onto YouTube, but it's a slow process. We had somebody from YouTube who was brilliant at YouTube, and he said, don't put them all at once, which would have been a challenge anyway, but basically put them on every 3 days. So that's exactly what we're doing. But when it comes to show notes pages, is there any kind of tips that you give to podcasts to actually do them differently, do them to a formula?
Well, I even think going back to the word podcast, right? What is a podcast? It's evolving now, right? Yeah. I remember asking my youngest daughters, what's the pod stand for in a podcast? And they roll their eyes and like, I don't know, Dad, what's it? They don't know a world with iPods. And, there we go.
There's an original iPod. You're impressed I had one of those on the bookshelf, aren't you?
I was going to say, I think I've got one that was, about that age there. And I remember when you had to plug it in to download, but now 3 out of 4 podcasts have video included with them. Different terrestrial or satellite radio stations have bought podcast networks so they can get the content. So I don't think it's this audio only medium. So I always say, create in the way that's easiest for you, and then put it out there in the way that's easiest for other people. So your show notes are great because there's people that are hearing impaired, right? They're not going to listen to the podcast, but they may read the show notes or the transcripts, right? People will actually read those. Putting it up on YouTube. The younger the people are, the more likely they are to sit and watch us, 3 guys talking. Whereas if somebody's driving, at least now, without self-driving cars, hopefully they're just listening to us. So I think it's this all of the above. Create it in the way that's easiest for you, then repurpose it in the way that's easiest for other people.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it can actually be self-driving, but I just don't want to pay the $7,000. Kevin's car, it can be self-driving as well, but it'll crash into the wall before he gets out of the garden. So,
yeah.
The thing is, you've got to buy the right car, Kevin, to do this. You really have to get the right car.
I'm sorry, I'll stick with the British one, thank you. I'm not convinced by American cars.
I'm not particularly fond of China, given what they've just done to us, and the last week they went even further down in my estimation. But they built my bloody car. Nonetheless, but I choose to think it was. Elon's a great chap.
Mine was built in a factory near Birmingham.
Says it all. And no, it's bloody broken down, Kevin. What's wrong with you? You're always moaning about it. Friday afternoon cars, yours. Anyway, so Tom, if you had to almost like choose. Is it one of the best podcasts you've ever been on, apart from ours? And I don't want you to embarrass yourself. But what's the thing that you think, good God, they've got it right?
I think it's the follow-up questions. You talked before about this being public speaking. I think at times podcast interviews for me have been therapy, where I'll tell a story to answer a question, and they'll ask that follow-up question, right? And, well, how'd that make you feel? Or tell me about this. And those are the ones that I think are most engaging to people. Nobody wants to hear canned stories and just talking points. But my bride listens to all of my interviews. And there's been a couple where she'll say, you were choking up there when you were talking about your dad. And I'm like, yeah, I hadn't heard that story, or I hadn't thought of that story in ages. And it just came to mind when they asked me that question. So I think it's asking those follow-up questions, listening and asking the questions that the audience is thinking, not just, hey, here's the next one on my list, right? I've been on some shows where, no matter what I said, the next question was going to be, great. So tell me what book is on your nightstand now.
Yeah.
It's just very transactional
to those. And you listen to all, 9.5 podcasts that particular individual managed to produce. And that question, what book is on your nightstand just now, will be on every podcast. I absolutely hate that sort of thing.
Yeah, but anyway, Tom, tell us what's on your nightstand at the moment. But it's probably no. I couldn't possibly ask that question because it's. I'm not even sure I'd be interested in the answer. Seriously, I do think you've obviously started a business that's all about helping people. I genuinely think that's the case. Podcasting is a brilliant area to be in. We love it. Naturally, we love it. We're doing it every week. It's a sort of an unpaid giving back thing for us, I think. But nonetheless, we enjoy it and we are curious.
There's an interesting question though coming up. It's an unpaid giving back thing. Well, no, Tom's got a business model around this.
All right. So we're doing it wrong.
We could be at a point here, Graham, that says, actually, we're not doing this unpaid anymore. Now, Interview Valet, you're talking to clients about getting them on podcasts. And you also said earlier on that podcast hosts, for all their hard work and building an audience, shouldn't go unrewarded. So think about that model. What are the economics in there, Tom?
The economics is, we look at it as we've got two clients, right? We've got a double-sided marketplace. We've got guests, but we've also got hosts, right? And early on, people said, well, why don't you charge the hosts and the guests? Because there's some people that are hosts that have asked us, can we hire you to find guests? And while it makes sense from a financial aspect, I don't know how you could ever do it without setting up a perception of a conflict of interest, right? You can only work for one person, right? Yeah, so right. We serve the hosts, and our goal is to make it easy for a host to say yes to an Interview Valet guest. So promoting it, getting all the information. one of the things that we're doing now with all of our clients is they are committed to collaborative promotion, right? So if you get a guest from Interview Valet, you know that they're going to promote it on their social media, on the company's social media. We also do a lot with podcasters to help them with the best practices, things that we learn there. But as far as paying podcast hosts, that's something that we've talked with legal advisors here in the U.S., and they're like, that's not the best practice, because it clearly violates the rules in the United States unless it's clearly delineated on the podcast, and we don't have control over that. So it's just something we've never done there.
Okay. So if I might be slow on the uptake, and I generally am, it's podcast owners like Kevin and I who pay you to get guests onto their podcasts.
There are podcasters out there that will pay for guests. And to me, I don't understand that, right?
No, I don't understand.
Because you're adding all the value.
So that's not your business model then, Tom?
Our business model is more like a PR agency where somebody comes to us and say, hey, I want to get this exposure to, print media, TV, radio, right? Yeah. And you don't get on Wall Street Journal because you paid to be there, right? The best podcasts, the best television stations, the best newspapers, that would violate their ethical standards too.
Sure. So your guests pay you, and then you get them onto us. So is it a fairly costly exercise for your guests to pay you?
We always try to get them the maximum return on investment of their time and their money, right? So what we do is not magic. It's not a secret. I wrote a book about it, and then I give away more of the books than anything that says just how to do it, right? Yeah. But people will say, I don't want to do all of this, right? You've already got the infrastructure for it. You've got the people, you've got the data, so you can find the podcast. So they hire us to do that. And we, someday we may be all replaced by AI, but we are a very people-driven culture right now, right? We use databases, but this idea of just sending out robo pitches, I don't think that adds value to the community, right? You mentioned that you're starting to get, the pitches from different people about being guests. I probably get 3 or 4 of those a day. Everybody loves my podcast and wants to be on it. The problem is I'm on a list, but I don't have a podcast. And those are almost joked about now in the industry.
One of the things about Interview Valet is that people must gravitate to you because, problem for somebody wants to get higher awareness. Podcast's brilliant way to do that. You go in like the Fifth Army and get them on 500 podcasts, and they're frazzled at the end of it. But good God, everybody knows them in America, and isn't that what you're doing? And actually, they think you're brilliant. They pay you a shed load of money, and effectively, that's your model, isn't it? You want people to become superstars through through podcasts.
Actually, if somebody came to us with that, we wouldn't take them as a client, and I would advise them against that. We had somebody that came, and I can still remember she wanted to be on 100 podcasts in a month, and I'm like, why? And because I'll be famous and all this exposure, and I'm like, more is not better. Better is better. The people that we work with are not looking to. They've got a goal to build their brand or their business. They're just not trying to get internet famous. And so we advise them not to do more interviews, but to do more with the interviews. That's why all of our clients are promoting the interviews, right? They're repurposing the content. They're using that. And for most of our clients, we advise them not to do more than one great podcast interview a week, right? Why don't you do better interviews as opposed to just doing Groundhog's Day? And, there's some agencies out there that their business model is, yeah, we'll get you on 500 shows. And I sort of look at that as like, if I'm looking for a bride, right? I don't want to go on 500 dates this month, right? I want to find that one special person. So from that standpoint, we try to do more, or to do better, not just more.
I can see why your better half thought you were Chuck. You're quite a mushy person, really, aren't you, Tom? I mean, you get really teary-eyed about all these guests and so forth. And the truth is, I think you're right. I mean, those people who have this, we did have a guest on, Stephen. He had his Millionaires program, and he was going through. I think, did he say he was doing about 250 podcasts in 250 days? And after about the 200th, he figured, oh boy, I've got this wrong.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, he'd spoken to 200 CEOs. And it's so his network is amazing. So it depends on how you look at it. And actually, he's got a brilliant voice. He's got a kind of like a voice that's been in a cigar room, and I'm not sure he smokes, but he should do. So I mean, the end of the day, just to keep the voice going. But I just think, I don't know. There's so many podcasts. I don't know how many podcasts have been going for 7 years. Probably not that many. But we might be in the top one, Kevin.
I think there's one or two that have been going longer.
Oh, is it? All right, fair enough.
Some of the ones that set us off to start podcasting, yeah. Jason Van Orden, Jeremy Franson with Internet Business Mastery,
yeah,
where we managed to meet each other. They survived for about 150 episodes, and they've disappeared off the face of the planet.
They ended up hating each other, though, didn't they, Kevin? At the end of the day, I mean, is this going to be our future?
Well, it might be, Graham. If Leeds United get in the Champions League again, that could well be the case.
Oh, my Lord. He's brought it back to football. Do you follow football over in Michigan? You probably don't. You have that strange game over in America called American football.
The funny part is that I don't follow what you call football, but I was reading a book to my grandkids, and they got to the word football, and I changed it to soccer. Because it was a British book, and my granddaughter stopped me and she's like, that doesn't start with an S. And then I had to explain with her that we speak different English.
Yes, that's true.
Yes.
But amazingly, though, Americans are getting better at football, and my team have got I think 2 American internationals in there, and we've got an American coach. Sort of a Ted Lasso, if you like. And the point is, he's doing a pretty fair job, and we as fans, we like him. So big on Americans. We love Americans in this podcast. You're self-accepted, to be honest with you, Tom. I mean, we have to have standards, but the beauty is a standard usually has a line, and then, well, it's got to be propped up somehow. But no, it's been, honestly, Tom. If you had to say. These are the sort of 3 things that most podcasts get wrong. What do you think they are?
I would say focusing on an interview, not a conversation, not putting their listeners first, because guests will come and go, sponsors will come and go, listeners will be with you the long time. And then the third thing would be continuing to upgrade as podcasting upgrades. So you can look back at, listen to your episodes 7 years ago and you'll cringe, right?
Yeah,
you're better. You've got better equipment. You're doing video now. Yeah. And so I think some of those podcasts that have that same format of, here's the 10 questions I ask, I don't do video, I've got my workflow in. I think podcasting is passing them by. And it's interesting. You always see, some podcasts peak and then die off, and other ones continue to evolve.
Great advice. I honestly, Tom, you really have been a good guest on the next 100 Days podcast. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Well, thank you so much. And, I appreciate all that you do. Anybody that says doing a podcast is easy has never done it or never done it well.
Graham, perhaps we're doing one or two things right on this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, we'll probably find out in time just how rare we are as a podcaster, doing more than, a podcast every week for about 45 to an hour, and going for about 7 years. So, at the end of the day, there won't be that many people that have managed to survive that long. And many of the podcasts, as Tom said, burn up after about 10 episodes and never
and they don't go on paying the hosting fees, so those podcast episodes disappear forever. A bit like those old BBC black and white programs that would be great if somebody hadn't taped over the top of them or thrown them away.
Well, I guess, and we've made, and just in case you're listening to this and you would prefer to see us, which suggests that you've really you've got to look at yourself in the mirror and think, what on earth would you want to see these two old blokes for? But many people do, and they want to see the video of the recording and listen to it that way. So we've decided a couple of weeks ago that we would start a new YouTube channel, and that's exactly what we're doing. So what we're doing is we're adding content, initially at least, from our 300th episode forward. So at the moment, what you're going to see is a number of episodes, and all you have to do is to type in the next 100 days, probably put podcast on, and then you'll find our podcast on YouTube, and you'll see a number of these podcasts starting at episode number 300, and then eventually we'll work backwards and add a few more from there. So as you know, we've got our own website, so you can actually go there and listen to any podcasts you want. But it is important that we move with the times, and you pushed on this, Kevin, quite a bit, and so we're on YouTube as well.
We are, and it'll just go to help the SEO along. And that all says that if you want to be a podcast guest, if you want to get your name out there on a podcast, then please give Graham and I a shout. Just all you need to do is go to the main page on the website at www.next100days.org, and there is a link on there that sends you to the podcast guest application form.
Yeah, it's not a big form. I
think there's about three questions on there. And,
yeah, I mean, it's just
I think 95% of people that have sent those back, we've said yes to.
Yeah, no, and it's such an easy way of actually getting in touch with us, and it's really nice to hear from you. So if you've got an idea that you've got something to share, or not that you just want to chat, but at the end of the day, you've got a chat with a purpose. If you've got some idea that you think is going to be relevant to the audience that we have, and let's face it, they're interested in business up to a point, but our listeners won't take themselves too seriously because they're listening to our podcast. At the end of the day, what we want to be able to do is deliver great value through fantastic guests, and that's what we're trying to do, whether that's recently the imposter syndrome, or whether that's today to do with being a podcast guest, or whether that's an investment opportunity, or whatever it is.
So another great show in the background.
Yeah, well, again, today I've been Graham Arrowsmith.
I've still been Kevin Appleby. Goodbye.
Goodbye.